for another reading hour. Just gotta give Instagram a second to catch up and then we'll get started. Hopefully this is not too laggy. I don't know why, but all of a sudden everything just seems to be a major tax on my computer. It's just like really heavy. I don't know if all the programs updated and they got worse all of a sudden, but all right, back to the Gladio book. So we are now on chapter 12. This is the new network. What is important to the history of the world? The Taliban or the collapse of the Soviet Empire? Some stirred up Muslims or the liberation of Central Europe and the end of the Cold War? Zbigniew Brzezinski, The Grand Chessboard, 1998. So that must be a quote from his book there. Interesting that would be Zbignew's perspective. What is really important? Just some group of Muslims that are angry? Or something Eurocentric that I could focus on instead? With the fall of Saigon, the drought in Southeast Asia, and the eradication of poppy fields in Burma and Thailand, the CIA set its sights on the Golden Crescent, where the highlands of Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Iran all converge, for a new source of drug revenue. Since the 17th century, opium poppies were grown in this region by local tribesmen, and the market remained regional. By the 1950s, very little opium was being produced in Afghanistan and Pakistan, with about 2,500 acres in both countries under cultivation. At the close of the Vietnam War, the fertile growing fields of Afghanistan's Helmand Valley were covered with vineyards, wheat, and cotton. The major problem for the CIA was the Afghan government of Nur Muhammad Taraki, who sought to eradicate poppy production in the border regions of the country that remained occupied by radical Islamic fundamentalists. This attempt at eradication sprang from Taraki's desire to unite all the Pashtun tribes under Kabul rule. The fundamentalists spurned such efforts not only because of their desire to keep the cash crops, but also because they viewed the Taraki government as shirk or blasphemy. The modernist regime advocated female education and prohibited arranged marriages and the bride price. By 1975, the tension between the government and the fundamentalists erupted into violence when Pashtun tribesmen mounted a revolt in the Panjshir Valley north of Kabul. The tribesmen were led by Gulbuddin Hekmatyar. He is another infamous name in these CIA operations, who became the new darling of the CIA. See, there you go. This must have been the start of their long and friendly relationship. Hopefully this stream is working pretty well. Let's see. So this next section here is the Muslim Madman. Hekmatyar made his public debut in 1972 at the University of Kabul by killing a leftist student. He fled to Pakistan, where he became an agent of Inter-Services Intelligence, or ISI, and the leader of Hezb-e-Islami, an organization dedicated to the formation of a, quote, pure Islamic state ruled by the most intransigent interpretation of Sunni law. Hekmatyar urged his followers to throw acid in the faces of women not wearing a veil, kidnapped rival Islamic chieftains, and in 1977 began to build up an arsenal courtesy of the CIA. The agency also began to funnel millions to the ISI, which became its surrogate on the Afghan border. The CIA believed that Hekmatyar, despite the fact that he was clearly unhinged, would be of inestimable value, not only in undermining the Taraki government, but also in gaining control of the poppy fields in the Helmand Valley. Its faith was not misplaced. Throughout 1978, a year before the Soviet invasion, Hekmatyar and his Mujahideen, or Holy Warriors, burned universities and girls' schools throughout Afghanistan and gained feudal control over many of the poppy farmers. The pro-Taraki militants, aware of the destabilization plot, assassinated Adolf, quote, Spike Dubs, the U.S. ambassador to Kabul, on February 14, 1979. Thanks to Hekmatyar's actions, heroin production rose 400 tons in 1971 to 1,200 tons in 1978. Rose from 400 tons in 1971 to 1,200 tons in 1978. So yeah, quite an increase over that 7-year span. After the assassination of Dubs, and after the millions had begun to flow to Hekmatyar's guerrilla army, The production soared to 1,800 tons, and a network of laboratories were set up by the Mujahideen along the Afghan-Pakistan border. The morphine base was transported by caravans of trucks from the Helmand Valley through northern Iran to the Anatolian plains of Turkey. Yeah, so they've got their whole transit and drug network set up now. Just took a few years to get all their assets in place and get the network set up, but they were able to do it. And the cover of war provides a convenient smokescreen. So this next section here is the Holy War. In the summer of 1979, 6 months before the Soviet invasion, the U.S. State Department issued a memorandum making clear its stake in the Mujahideen. Quote, the United States' larger interest would be served by the demise of the Taraki regime, despite whatever setbacks this might mean for future social and economic reform in Afghanistan. So yeah, regrettably, even if this like knocks the country socially backwards several hundred years, even doesn't matter. We need those drugs. We need those funds. We need our assets in place and controlling things. But they continue here. The overthrow of the DRA, the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan, would show the rest of the world, particularly the Third World, that the Soviets' view of the socialist course of history as being inevitable is not accurate. So yeah, they're just going to say, we're going to prevent that development. They're literally saying, we're going to prevent humanity's development. It is not just a straightforward thing. We can actually keep people regressing, entire cultures and societies regressing if we want, just through militant force. In September 1979, Taraki was killed in a coup organized by Afghan military officers. Hafizullah Amin was installed as the country's new president. Amin had impeccable Western credentials. He had been educated at Columbia University and the University of Wisconsin. Gross. He had served as the president of the Afghan Students Association, which had been funded by the Asia Foundation, a CIA front. After the coup, he met regularly with U.S. embassy officials, while the CIA continued to fund Hekmatyar's rebels in Pakistan. Let's see. Sorry. Uh, Fearing a fundamentalist US backed regime at its border, the Soviets invaded Afghanistan on December 27, 1979. The CIA got what it wanted. The Holy War had begun. For the next decade, black aid, amounting to more than $3 billion, would be poured into Afghanistan to support the Holy Warriors, making it the most expensive covert operation in US history. Yeah, that's something that people don't often talk about. It's like, that's a cool term for that is black aid. Like quite literally black funds, secret funds, clandestine operations being funded by these uh, drug profits, like quite literally proceeds from drug smuggling, calling that black aid. That's a good term for that. Such vast expenditures demanded an exponential increase in poppy production, which Hekmatyar and his fellow jihadists were pleased to provide. The next section here is called Afghanistan Delight. The war in Afghanistan delighted State Department officials, including Secretary of State Zbigniew Brzezinski, voicing the utopian vision of what author Chalmers Johnson called the quote military-industrial complex. Brzezinski wrote of the plans to control Eurasia, including Turkey, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. For America, the chief geopolitical prize is Eurasia. Now a non-Eurasian power is preeminent in Eurasia, and America's global primacy is directly dependent on how long and how effectively its preponderance on the Eurasian continent is sustained. To put it in a terminology that harkens back to the more brutal age of ancient empires, the three great imperatives of imperial geostrategy are to prevent collusion and maintain security dependence among the vassals, to keep tributaries pliant and protected, and to keep the barbarians from coming together. I mean, that is quite literally the Western neoconservative and neoliberal analysis of the world. They just now apply that to all of the Middle East, all of Asia, and all of Russia. Brzezinski and fellow members of his quote overworld, the elite group which puppeteers events to bring about a new world order, realized that the concept of democracy and freedom could never galvanize the scattered tribes and peoples of Central Asia. The people could only be unified by the cause of Allah, since they were overwhelmingly Islamic. The Holy War in Afghanistan, in the view of American geostrategists, offered many benefits, including the possible downfall of the Soviet Union and the possibility of gaining access and control over the vast natural gas and oil resources of Eurasia. Months before the Soviet invasion in 1979, the CIA launched Operation Cyclone, an attempt to destabilize the Soviet Union by spreading militant Islam throughout Central Asian republics. Eventually, the operation would serve to create hundreds of Islamic terror organizations, including Al Qaeda, Al Jihad, the Ulema Union of Afghanistan, the Salafi Group for Proselytism and Combat, the Islamic Movement of Uzbekistan, Harkat ul Ansar, Jamia, Jamiat Ulema e Islam, Jamia Ulema e Pakistan, Lashkar e Taiba, and the Al Jihad Group. It would also give rise to terror attacks that would kill and maim millions of people throughout the world and the dream of a new Islamic world order, which would be espoused by Fethullah Gulen, Giilen, and his disciples. Okay, interesting. It's crazy because like everybody sort of implicitly knows by this point that the U.S. created all these Islamic fundamentalist groups. They just, I guess, think that this was part of some kind of like rogue parts of the US government, or that the US used to do that but then doesn't do it anymore, or that it was like justified for some kind of reasons, or that it may have seemed justified at the time but then got out of hand when those groups turned against us for whatever reason. Um, the point is that Americans have all kinds of like wacky ideas about the US and its role in creating these Islamic fundamentalist terror groups. They just never connect the big picture, which is that the US has always done these kind of things to fight the actual anti-imperialist alliances, and the U.S. is still doing those very same things, which you can see in like the overthrow of the Syrian government, the fact that ISIL, Al Qaeda, like none of those groups never go after Israel. So weird. Yeah, but this is all just to say, like we had sort of known that about all these other ones, but I can't believe how many more there were that have fallen by the wayside, that have since obviously dissolved or been kind of gobbled up by the bigger ones, I guess. So this next section here is the BCCI. In 1972, the Bank of Credit and Commerce International, the BCCI, was set up in Karachi by Aga Hassan Abedi, a financier who had deep connections to Pakistan's underworld, the Turkish Babas, members of Turkey's underworld, and the oil-rich sheikhs of Abu Dhabi. It represented the ideal spot for CIA to set up a laundry within the Golden Crescent. Thanks to the agency, the BCCI was registered in Luxembourg and soon mushroomed into a vast criminal enterprise with 400 branches in 78 countries, including the First American Bank in Washington, D.C., the National Bank of Georgia, and the Independence Bank of Encino, California. Virtually free from scrutiny, it engaged not only in laundering the heroin proceeds but also arms trafficking on a grand scale, including the sale of French-made jet fighters to Chile and Chinese silkworm missiles to Saudi Arabia. Chinese silkworm missiles? That's a thing? That's wild. What do those do? Like by 1985, it had become the seventh largest financial institution in the world, handling the money for Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein, Panamanian strongman Manuel Noriega, Palestinian terrorist Abu Nidal, Al Qaeda chieftain Osama bin Laden, Liberian President Samuel Doe, and leading members of the Medellin cartel. Man, it sounds like you should just investigate this one bank and the people who run it. Why doesn't that happen, I wonder? Prominent spooks, including CIA Director William Casey, made regular visits to the BCCI's headquarters in Karachi, making the Pakistani city the new haven for covert operations. The bank served the agency in a myriad of ways by paying bribes, providing, quote, young beauties from Lahore, uh, okay, and funneling cash for assassins. I guess we're just gonna move over that trafficking allegation right there. I'm sure we'll hear some more about it. The enormity of the bank's operations was evidenced by its transfer of $4 billion in covert aid to Iraq from 1985 to 1989. For the Iraqi transfer, the BCCI made use of the Atlanta branch of the Banca Nazionale del Lavoro, or BNL, an Italian bank with ties to the IOR. Yeah, totally normal for this Vatican bank to have a branch in Atlanta, Georgia. That's not weird at all. Henry Kissinger sat on BNL's International Advisory Board, along with Brent Scowcroft, who became President George H.W. Bush's national security advisor. John R. Bath, an alleged CIA operative, just alleged, I'm sure we can't infer anything there, became one of BCCI's directors. While serving the Pakistani bank, Bath was the co-owner of Arbusto Energy, a Texas oil company, with future President George W. Bush. Kamal Adam, a fellow BCCI official, served, according to the Kerry Commission, as, quote, the principal liaison for the CIA in the entire Middle East from the mid 1960s through 1979. Okay, interesting. This next section here is phony audits. Sorry, I'm just going to see if I can address something on my computer real quick. Okay, sorry. So this next section here is phony audits. Although a cursory investigation would have uncovered the bank's engagement in issuing, making phantom deposits, and publishing false financial reports, Price Waterhouse, the prestigious London accounting firm, published annual statements giving BCCI its unqualified approval. Okay, so again, even the slightest investigation into this bank would prove it to be a totally fraudulent and clandestine enterprise, like an obvious front for black operations, for uh, money laundering and drug smuggling. But they were getting great ratings from all the official institutions. The Kerry Commission later concluded that the Price Waterhouse accountants, quote, failed to protect BCCI's innocent depositors and creditors from the consequences of poor practices at the bank, of which the auditors were aware for years. In 1991, the BCCI, like so many other CIA banks, went bust, leaving a financial hole of $13 billion. Creditors subsequently brought action against Price Waterhouse, claiming damages because of the firm's accounting negligence in excess of $11 billion. The matter was eventually settled out of court. It's like I don't know what better example you can pull up than these kind of like black and white fraudulent schemes where CIA front banks go bust because the money is just not there. There once like finally there is like some slight investigation into it and the whole thing just collapses. But then neoliberals can just totally ignore this and say, well, they wouldn't do stuff like that anymore. Uh, that couldn't be responsible in any way for like entire sectors of the economy relying on fictitious capital. Nah. Ironically, in the wake of this settlement, the Vatican turned to Price Waterhouse to certify its balance sheets, a choice that journalist David Yallop characterized as, quote, bizarre. Yeah, that is bizarre to say the least. That's one word for it. This next section here is the CIA's complicity. In its opening statement regarding the CIA's relationship to BCCI, the Kerry Commission maintained the relationships I guess this is a quote here. The relationships involving BCCI, the CIA, and members of the United States and foreign intelligence communities have been among the most perplexing aspects of understanding the rise and fall of BCCI. Is it perplexing? Is it really that puzzling? Is it really a big mystery? Or is it just like one of those situations where someone understanding something, I guess someone's income is entirely dependent on them not understanding something, so they don't? Let's see. The CIA's and BCCI's mutual environments of secrecy have been one obvious obstacle. For many months, the CIA resisted providing information to the subcommittee about its involvement with and knowledge of BCCI. Moreover, key players who might explain these relationships are unavailable. Are they dead? Are they sleeping with the fishes? Are they at the bottom of the ocean with concrete shoes? Some, including former CIA Director William Casey and BCCI customers and Iranian arms dealers Banerjee and Cyrus Hashemi, are dead. Okay, yeah. Others, including most of BCCI's key insiders, remain held incommunicado in Abu Dhabi. While promising in public hearings to provide full cooperation to the subcommittee, to date the Abu Dhabi government has refused to make any BCCI officers available for interview by the subcommittee. Former BCCI chairman Aga Hassan Abedi remains severely incapacitated due to a heart attack. Finally, some persons in a position to know portions of the truth have denied having any memory of events in which they participated and of documents which they reviewed. Hmm. Yeah, classic. Remember, the CIA has a heart attack gun. They have admitted to this. All right, I'll go on with this one for like another minute or so. I'm at 19 minutes so far. So the next section here is Turkey's deep state. Establishing Turkey as the pivotal center of the heroin route from the Gold Crescent was a relatively easy task for U.S. intelligence officials. By 1970, the CIA had infiltrated the Turkish Secret Service (MIT) Milli İstihbarat Teşkilatı, National Intelligence Organization. The full extent of this infiltration was made known by Sabahattin Savasman, the vice director of MIT, who testified, quote, the CIA has a group of at least 20 people who work together with the MIT and within the MIT at the highest level. He said that the agency trained all MIT personnel, provided all the necessary equipment, including a torture chamber, and paid all the bills. Oh my god. Yeah, we'll build you a whole torture chamber. It's fine. This payment would have been substantial since at that time the MIT employed, quote, several hundreds of thousands of agents, consultants, and technicians. Throughout the 1970s, the CIA also continued to train and support all members of Counter Guerrilla, the organization containing all Turkish Gladio units, including the Grey Wolves. The recruits were trained at paramilitary centers in Ankara, Bolu, Kayseri, Buka near Izmir, Kanakkale, and Cyprus by members of U.S. Special Forces, including the Green Berets. The key training manual, FM 3031, taught the secret soldiers how to launch terror attacks and to place the blame on the communists. The Grey Wolves, as the militant arm of the Pan Turkism movement, embraced the training wholeheartedly. They believed in the racial superiority of the Turks and the sacred task of restoring the Ottoman Empire, the latter belief necessitating the elimination of the Kurds from the southeast region of the country. By 1976, there were 1,700 Grey Wolves organizations within Turkey, with about 200,000 registered members and well over a million sympathizers. Awesome. Great. Yeah, I mean, that's the inside joke being that the Chapo Patreon supporters are known as the Grey Wolves. They are referencing this exact series of events, Operation Gladio, uh, the fascist militant organizations that the CIA created, set up, took advantage of, whatever involvement they had. They were definitely funding them. So I'm going to bookmark this one here. All right, now we will switch over to Western Marxism. Okay, so picking back up on the Western Marxism book, this is Domenico Losurdo, translated and edited by Gabriel Rockhill. More generally, erasing colonialism from history makes understanding capitalism impossible. If we analyze the capitalist countries together with their colonies, we realize that we are looking at a double standard, one for the race of the conquerors and one for the race of the conquered. In this sense, the racial state, or quote, state racism, to use Foucault's term, accompanies the history of colonialism and capitalism like a shadow. Except that this phenomenon is most visibly present in the United States because of the spatial contiguity in which the different quote races live. Unfortunately, in reconstructing the history of racism, the French philosopher erases not only the colonialist legacy but also socio-political history. He doesn't begin with the encounter conflict between very different cultures and the relationship instituted by the West that, over time, became that of colonial and semi colonial worlds. He focuses instead on a chapter of history that is entirely internal to the West, and indeed to France. This is not about the country, metropolis, and colonies in which the revolution condemned and abolished racism and the slavery regime that had existed in Saint Domingue that was based on the domination of the quote aristocracy of skin and sanctioned by law. It is not about the country in which the first epic test of power between champions of and opponents of black slavery and of the racial state occurred. No, it is another France that is at the center of the history of racism delineated by Foucault. In very vague terms and without any mention of text nor of specific authors, he refers to the discourse established at the turn of the Revolution that read sociopolitical conflict in racial terms, not in the French Empire as a whole, but in metropolitan France, again ignoring the colonies. If Boulam-Villers defended the privileges of the nobles as heirs of the victorious French, authors such as Sieyès and Thierry replied by demanding the Gallic-Roman right, or that of the Third Estate, to throw off the domination of the Franks imposed on them. Once again, the unique way Foucault proceeds stands out, as he starts not on Villers, but from his opponents. The revolutionaries would have been the first to read the sociopolitical conflict in racial terms. But let us also abstract from this. Were Boulan-Villers' critics really suffering from racism? Did they intend to carve out a naturalistic and insuperable, quote, heterogeneity among the political social subjects in struggle? Where the position of absolute privilege demanded by champions of aristocracy? Quote, the privileged actually come to see themselves as another species of man, a superior species. As the reference to a common humanity demonstrates, we see here a critique of racism, not its theorization. Is it still true that, quote, the history of some is not the history of others? When in 1853 Thierry wrote the history of the Third Estate, he began with the struggle between the Franks and the Gauls, but ended up celebrating the progressive, quote, fusion of races. This progress brought about the, quote, end of the distinction of races, end of, quote, all the legal consequences of diversity of origin. And all this happened thanks to a struggle that saw the serfs and others socially excluded polemicize against the feudal lords in the following terms, quote, we are men as well as they. Is this a racist discourse or a critique of one? or a critique of one. See, I just don't particularly like the idea that Foucault just leaves out colonialism. Like this is what we spent a lot of time talking about in the last session, of course. He explains how Foucault's theorization of uh, totalitarianism, of subjugation, of the prison, of the authority of society being exercised on everyone, he has to like make it this weird, abstract, like almost spiritual kind of thing. And it only makes sense if you realize that the whole function of that is just to ignore actual oppression, actual colonialism, actual neocolonialism, and actual like race relations that codify this kind of oppression that people in the West, of course, live on and benefit from. And so when you have somebody like Foucault come along, it really makes a lot of sense why this like nonsensical philosophy, like this literal jargon that he puts forward, gets so popular. When you realize it's quite literally the CIA and all the intelligence agencies of Western countries who promote it, who make sure that like Foucault gets to be popular and put in front of you, while the black authors, while actual decolonial authors and thinkers do not. It's not an accident. Regarding Boulain-Villers, Thierry justified the privileges of the class he belonged to by referring to a conflict between different, quote, races. But this always meant races that were internal to the West. He compared the Third Estate to the Gallic Romans, who were, yes, defeated, but not outside of the area of civilization. They were not comparable to the blacks of the colonies, that is, to a quote, race considered inferior by nature and by nature capable of only servile labor. Boulain-Villers certainly did not propose to subject the bourgeoisie, which in France had experienced a remarkable social ascent, to slavery or colonial subjugation. He meant instead to strengthen the exclusive character of aristocratic privilege. The process of authentic racialization happened instead, first of all, to colonial peoples, and secondarily to the popular classes of the metropoles, who were often compared to the savages of the colonies. So, yeah, that's a great way of explaining how this racial stratification, like making up this social fiction of race and adhering to it while claiming to be for liberty and democracy, it still hurts the lower classes of the people who are in the metropoles themselves, who are within the imperial core, not the colonized places, because they get compared and treated very much like those colonized people. The upper strata of the Third Estate participated in these processes, the same strata that claimed a common humanity only as part of the struggle against the privileges of the aristocracy. All of this has been omitted from Foucault's conceptual history. In his work, there is no space for the long term processes of racialization and dehumanization that were imposed on the colonial peoples, just as there is no space for the great struggles of recognition, starting with that which, with the radicalization of the French Revolution, brought about the abolition of slavery in the colonies. We are led to ask ourselves to explain the history of Western racism. Is We are led to ask ourselves to explain the history of Western racism. Is a handful of French intellectuals' debate over Franks and Gallic Romans really more important than the wars of conquest against peoples considered a mass of homunculi, bereft of human dignity and fated to be enslaved or annihilated, as happened during what has sometimes been defined, because of its immensity, quote, the greatest genocide in the history of humanity, the one committed in the wake of the discovery conquest of the Americas? As far as France is concerned, is the small chapter of the history of ideas that Foucault focuses on more important than the French Revolution or the war fought in Saint Domingue over black slavery? This was a gigantic conflict in which great masses of people were involved, and that constitutes a central chapter of world history. And yet, all that is too intrinsically tied to material things, the chains of real slavery, the profits made in the slave trade and from the sale of products of slavery, and too well known to gain any interest from Foucault, who is at work demonstrating that revolution and racism go hand in hand and pursuing an originality that borders on the esoteric. Yeah, I mean, that's a great way to tie up that whole section right there. Is like talking about Foucault as esoteric. Like literally just you have to be so original. Like the idea that like discussed it in this book, but like I see it a lot online and like the so-called discourse among leftists. It's like people act like you have to come up with an original idea. And I don't know where this demand comes from. Like, why do you need to come up with an original idea? And how are you not just doing Western individualism, like liberalism? Like, if you're telling people that the validity or the value of their ideas is based on how original, new, or innovative it is, then you are obviously not valuing learning, learning from history, learning from the past, learning from previous examples, and applying that to the modern era, you're valuing just coming up with ideas that are new just for the sake of novelty. And that's again just like liberalism. You should be evaluating ideas based on like how effective they actually are or how relevant to the current situation they are, not just whether they're new. His anti-revolutionary zeal and the cult of esotericism reached their culmination in the reading of the 3 decades of Stalinism as a regime of state and biological racism. The traditional theory of totalitarianism drags in and equates more or less radically Hitler's Germany and Stalin's Soviet Union, but a great distance and even an ideological antithesis remain between them. The former country openly proclaimed that it was building a colonial empire founded on white and Aryan supremacy. The latter, instead, was a champion of the struggle against colonialism and racism. Foucault carried out an operation that seemed too bold, even to the theorists of totalitarianism, to make Hitler and Stalin seem similar, even ideologically, as champions of quote biological racism. It was an undoubtedly novel thesis, but is it supported by some evidence or arguments resembling evidence? As far as the relationship with the external enemy is concerned, it was Ernst Nolte, the leader of historical revisionism, who observed that during the Second World War, the representation of Germany as quote racist was common in the West, quote with a sort of replica of the rating of the conflict quote dear to National Socialism, but not in the Soviet Union, which instead adhered to a quote historical representation. Indeed, it was not Stalin but Roosevelt who considered a biological solution. Quote, we either have to castrate the German people, or you have got to treat them in such a manner so they can't just go on reproducing people who want to continue the way they have in the past. Hmm, that's like a weird solution. Not by accident, at the end of the Second World War, criticizing this attitude, Benedetto Croce stressed that invoking quote sterilization was to follow quote the example of the very same Nazis. Mhm. Yeah, it would make sense that it would come to Churchill, to just do, like, a fucking Nazi solution to the Nazis themselves. Quality literally just doesn't even occur to Western liberals. Indeed, in the years of the Third Reich, the final solution was preceded by repeated calls for, quote, "sterilization" of the mass of the Jews. Moreover, Croce ignored that the Third Reich had taken much of its eugenics and racism from the United States, as evident in statements by Rosenberg and Hitler. Nevertheless, the fact remains that, with his pointed observation, the liberal philosopher refuted in advance the fantasy history of racism propounded by the French radical philosopher. Regarding the internal enemy, we recall a statement by Stalin that, quote, the son does not answer for the crimes of the father. At the end of 1935, Pravda announced that children of the privileged classes would no longer be barred from going to college. It is eloquent testimony to a pedagogical obsession that, in the work of the anti communist American historian Anne Applebaum, we find the Gulag characterized as follows. To the very end, while Hitler's war of annihilation raged, and the entire country found itself in an absolutely tragic situation, they managed to find and invest, quote, time and money for, quote, propaganda, manifestos, and political indoctrination meetings for those detained. The terroristic character of the dictatorship remains, as does the horror of the Gulag. But where is the biology? It is important to distinguish the political moral despecification, exclusion from the human and civil community, of religious or ideological wars, which leaves the victim a way out through conversion, from racial despecification that is natural and insurmountable. So that's a long winded way to say that, like, the enemies of fascism are immutable characteristics, like someone's skin color, because race is a fiction. Um, it's like their sex. It's physical characteristics that they cannot possibly change, or characteristics that are given to them by birth, by virtue of birth, that they absolutely cannot change. Whereas the enemies of the communists, the fascists, can stop being that. Like you can stop being a cop, you can stop being an intelligence officer, you can stop being a fascist, you can stop holding horrible opinions, you can stop being a reactionary. This goes back to the famous philosophy tube uh, friend enemy distinction. We may be repulsed by the crusade against the Albigensians, Albigensians and the Night of Saint Bartholomew, but I know of no historians who contextualize these events as part of the history of biological racism. So I don't even know enough about those events to say what they're about and how that's relevant. But someone in the chat could probably fill us in. A final consideration: when in 1976 Foucault gave his lecture at the Collège de France that we have analyzed here, The racist regime of apartheid South Africa was still alive and well. 10 years earlier, Arendt called attention to the ban that still existed in Israel against interracial marriages and other laws of similar inspiration, making a paradoxical analogy to the quote infamous Nuremberg laws issued in the fall of 1935. But when the French author searched for another reality comparable to the Third Reich as a form of quote state racism, he was able to identify only the Soviet Union. This country, from its founding, had played a decisive role in promoting the emancipation of the colonial peoples, and already in 1976 was on the front lines of denouncing the anti-black and anti-Arab policies of South Africa and Israel. That's actually a good meme. Is take the what is it? Is like Michael Jordan who's in that meme, and it's like I sleep versus real shit, and like just put Foucault in there, and it's like when he wants to talk about state racism, have him totally overlooking apartheid South Africa and then looking at some fake made up state racism he wants to point out about the Soviet Union. It's how it always works, folks. How it goes. How's it going, Shibbles? Sorry for taking a couple of days off. Gonna get back into the swing of it now, though. So let's see. I'll go on this one with for another few minutes. A final consideration. When in 1976, Foucault gave his lecture. Oh no, I read that one. Sorry. We're now on to chapter 8 on biopolitics. No less esoteric and no less zealously anti-revolutionary is the history that Foucault reconstructs of quote biopolitics, the category that owes its extraordinary success to the French philosopher, and for whom it helped explain the horrors of the 20th century. In an extremely brief summary, here is the history he explicated. Starting in the 20th century, a new vision and a quote new technology of power arose. It was not a question, as in the past, of disciplining the bodies of individuals. Now, power is applied not to man as body, but to the living man, to man as living being, affected by quote overall processes characteristic of birth, death, production, illness, and the reproduction of human life. Indeed, with the rise of biopolitics, power took possession of life in the 19th century, or at least power at least takes life under its care. And this quote succeeded in covering the whole surface that lies beneath the organic and the biological, between body and population, and biological processes as a whole, to preserve the security of the whole from internal dangers. Yeah, that whole paragraph is just annoying. Like that whole thing just seems inscrutable. It's totally incoherent, but it's great for like liberals who will read that kind of thing and be like, "Oh my god, this sounds like it's so deep. Like I don't really understand this, but it sounds like it's profound." So Foucault hating the same people that I hate and reaffirming the same things that I want reaffirmed, he must be correct. The biopolitical turn was full of perils. Then racism intervened as well, or rather state and biological racism, which sought, quote, a way of introducing a break into the domain of life that is under power's control, that between what must live and what must die, and this transformed biopolitics into a practice of death. From this would come the catastrophic consequences that we know of in the Stalinist USSR and in Nazi Germany, because they're both the same. As with his history of racism, so with that of biopolitics. The silence on colonialism is deafening since colonialism was the site of the birth of the former, as we have seen, and the latter, as we shall see below. What happened in the Americas with the arrival of the conquistadors is enlightening. The indigenous peoples were often condemned to work themselves to death. There was an unlimited supply of potential slaves, and no lack of those ready to increase their riches through the reproduction of the human animal they owned. Quote, Las Casas reports that the price of a female slave rises according to whether or not she is pregnant, exactly as in the case of cattle. Quote, this godforsaken man said that he worked as hard as he could to get the Indian women with child, for when he sold them as slaves, he would be paid more if they were pregnant. The testimony of Las Casas referred to a period in which the indigenous peoples had not yet been replaced by Africans as the enslaved labor force. With this change, the indigenous were erased from the face of the earth like some cumbersome ballast thrown overboard at sea, while the latter were made to work and reproduce themselves in slavery. Two practices reinforced and perpetuated the racial hierarchy in the English colonies of North America and then in the United States. A ban on miscegenation, or bastardization, that is, on sexual relations and marriage between the members of the quote superior race and the quote inferior race. In this way, a rigid legal and biopolitical barrier separated the race of the masters from that of the slaves to guarantee that the latter would remain docile and obedient. This led to the second practice, death by horrifying torture, awaited anyone who gave any sign that they had not understood the lesson. Once the undisturbed functioning of the institution of slavery had been assured, the human animal would be called upon to increase and multiply in numbers. Yeah. I mean, that's like the natural consequence, right? If you have people divided into these two categories, um, artificially created, the race thing that is just like based loosely on physical characteristics that the definition of also changes, since race can constantly change depending on different physical characteristics, depending on the needs of the oppressors at any given time, then you have to also militantly and violently enforce that by preventing these people from mixing and screwing up with this distinction you've created, with this line that you've artificially drawn. Wild shit. All right. I'm going to switch over now to the Soviets expected it. So we last left off, the paragraph before was with the conclusion of the first 5 year plan, the Soviet Union plunged into the second, which did 3 times as much new construction as the first 5 year plan had done, and did it with much less strain. Soviet industry was completely reorganized and equipped with the latest machines and methods. Greater emphasis was given than previously to producing goods of consumption. This, together with the rapid improvement of farming, caused a fairly swift rise in the general standard of living. Those were the years when the Soviet people grew lyrical over victories in production. Arriving foreigners spoke of the Russians' quote, romantic passion for machines. Poems and dramas were devoted to the ever rising curve of production, the opening of new industries, and the successful mastery of new technical processes. Scores of new cities arose on formerly barren land. Let's see. Thousands of geological expeditions penetrated the wilderness to discover and chart nationally owned wealth. The conquering march reached northward to settle the Arctic and eastward to the wild coast opposite Alaska. Yeah, you could see it from your house, apparently. Guided by radio, airplane, and icebreaker, trading ships began to sail from the Atlantic to the Pacific through the polar seas. In the latter half of 1935, Soviet workers began to storm the world frontiers of productivity. The Stakhanov movement arrived, named for a coal miner in the Donets Basin, who broke production records by devising a relatively simple division of labor. The same thing happened in other industries. This general level of efficiency was still far below that of Western Europe, but individual workers, amid the applause of their fellows, began to equal or even beat world records. Some coal miners in the Donbass doubled Ruhr production. Some foremen in the Gorky Auto Works broke standards set by Ford. Some shoemakers in Leningrad made records 50% higher than the world record held by the Bata factories of Czechoslovakia. The Soviet people glimpsed and felt victory. For the first time, they began to feel that they were no longer, quote, backward Russians. They were beginning to challenge the world. With this went a proud sense of their unity as a nation. Cotton growers in Turkestan exulted, quote, we have conquered the Arctic, though they themselves would never see the snow. Bearded peasants who had never sat in an airplane began to talk about, quote, our conquest of the air. Young Nina Kameneva expressed the mood of the country's young people when she broke a world's altitude record in parachute jumping and remarked on landing, quote, the sky of our country is the highest sky in the world. Yeah, it's like a crazy level of like national pride to be able to have, especially like when you make those kind of like leaps and bounds in technology and culture in such a short period of time, in like the span of like a 5 year plan or like going right into the next one. Some people even glimpsed utopia. Stakhanovite workers told me, quote, 10 years hence, we shall make easily all the goods we need. Farming and industry may cease to be our main problems. Art, science, exploration, and human development will become the chief interests. There are no limits to these. Even while they said it, an event had occurred, the assassination of Kirov, who was to plunge the Soviet people from this mood of triumph into years of watchfulness and suspicion, the shadow of approaching war. Or sorry, which was to plunge the Soviet people, sorry. So yeah, must have been a very ominous event. When the Second World War broke at last across Europe, 2 5 year plans had changed the USSR to a modern industrial nation, second only to the United States. Its industry lacked the smooth sureness of the older industrial countries, but its output was 17% above that of Germany and more than 10 times that of Tsarist Russia. Production per capita was considerably below that of Western Europe, which means that the standard of living was low. But because of the size of the country, production in absolute figures was colossal. This is what counts in war. Yeah, this is also like if you like. try to defend the Soviet Union to capitalists, to right wingers, to libertarians, to whoever are enemies of it, like ideologically, they have to do this like weird dance where they will say like, um, yeah, it's great that the Soviet Union was able to produce so much. They were able to catch up industrially to the West and even surpass them in many aspects and do it so fast. But then they will say, oh, but they had like a terrible standard of living. They were really bad to their people. People suffered because of it or whatever. And then if there are times where people in a socialist country are not producing as much, but their standard of living is higher, then they use that. They just flip it. They just say, "Well, look, the GDP is too low. They're not producing. They're not like these super efficient industrialists and businessmen. They're instead focusing on like social benefits or whatever." It's like they always have a way to excuse the imperialists and the capitalists who have both at once because they are extracting wealth from the global south, because they are exploiting labor, because they are using literal slave labor or stealing resources, or as we've discussed in other ways, having entire sub economies that are uh, under the table, that are like literally below board, like they are invisible, not officially reported, but they are the thing that props up the entire system. That's all just to say that only socialism can give you the kind of real material improvement that people would actually want in the working classes. A single farm implement works in Rostov, the Selmash. Uh, a single farm implement works in Rostov, the Selmash turns out more farm machinery than the whole of Germany produces. A single auto plant at Gorky on the Volga produces more auto trucks than all of Britain. Two steel towns in the Ural Siberia district make 30% more pig iron than all of Japan. Two new oil refineries in Baku refine more oil than all 42 refineries of Romania. More important even More important even than size is the fact that 80% of all production comes from new or thoroughly reconstructed modern plants. The chief handicap is that all of these enterprises are very new and the workers in them very inexperienced, but they are enthusiastic, energetic, and learning fast. In farming, the situation was also reassuring. The harvest of 1937 was the largest the country had ever known. The harvests of the next few years, while somewhat smaller, were even more significant, since they were secured not by grace of God and good weather, but in spite of considerable bad weather, including in many areas a record breaking drought. Modern farm methods conquered the difficult conditions, indicating that Soviet farms were no longer subject to periodic famines, as Tsarist farming had always been. Very important point there, can't overstate that enough. The modern mechanized farms of the farm collectives have brought 338,390,000 acres under production, 79,040,000 more than were farmed in 1913. 91% of Soviet farms are serviced by tractors and harvester combines, a far greater mechanization than prevails on American farms. Collectivization has created farms that in case of war can be made to produce effectively by women, old men, and boys. There is one very serious proviso. The farms need gasoline and spare parts. The Soviets have gambled their existence on the thesis that an industrial nation with both modern industry and industrialized farming has the advantage in modern war. They have built their total defense in armament, in industry, in farming, and in the development of the people. They built it barbarously. They wasted materials. They broke machines. They exhausted people. They built faster than could be built, for they built against time. And now the time against which they built has come. Yeah, very well put. Can I be talking about the outbreak of war? Section or chapter 5, Beyond the Urals. In the first days of the Soviet-German War, when Ivan Maisky, the Soviet ambassador to London, was asked, quote, what would happen if Moscow should fall, he answered, quote, even in that case we will fight on, supplied from the factories and the growing industries hidden behind the Urals. For years we have planned and built widely dispersed industries, vital to the war. The existence of this great economic base behind the Urals is one of the three reasons that Harry Hopkins is reported to have given for his belief that Hitler could not conquer Russia. Geography is a military weapon, as the Japanese have found to their cost in China. The geography of Russia once beat Napoleon. It is one of the factors that beat Hitler. Social and economic forces change, but geography remains, said a Soviet diplomat several years ago to me. In the past 15 years, the vast geography of Russia has been consciously organized for the plan of total defense. The sun that rises on the Pacific shores of the Soviet Union takes 11 hours to reach the battlefront on the western frontier. The reach of this mighty country is nearly halfway around the globe. It is by far the greatest piece of territory under one flag anywhere in the world. It is comparable to the whole continent of North America, with Hitler striking at the states on the Atlantic seaboard. To seize Leningrad, Kiev, Moscow, and even the oil of the Caucasus would not end Hitler's difficulties if the rest of this vast area remained able and willing to fight him. It is important, therefore, to know how this great hinterland lives and moves and has its being. Is it mere dead expanse of territory, or can it maintain a life of its own? Many writers have assumed that the Soviet government is so completely centralized that if Moscow were once penetrated, the land would fall to pieces. If the Soviet structure were imposed from above, this of course might happen, but the whole history of the Soviet land and its development shows that it is widely based on the initiative of the people. I once met a woman in a Soviet health resort who boasted that the region where she lived in Siberia had had Soviet power, quote, without a break and without even a battle, from the 1917 revolution right down to the present day. I ventured to challenge her statement. Didn't Kolchak hold Siberia? I asked. Kolchak held some points along the railroad, she answered, but we were nearly 200 of the railroad, and he never got up that far. She added that the forms of Soviet power had been set up by the local peasants. Uh, that the forms of power of Soviet power had been set up by the local peasants, led by Bolshevik exiles who happened to be in that district when the revolution came. They had kept in touch with Moscow by the Great Northern Telegraph Line, which passes through the region. Today, of course, they would have the radio. There were many other regions that were separated from Moscow for long periods during the War of Intervention of 1918 to 20, yet retained the Soviet form of government, kept up communications, and carried on parallel actions. Yeah, that's another. I guess if you look at these as like a macrocosm, then the microcosm would be something like a vanguard party that has decentralized cells. And even though there is leadership, and even though there is communication between the leadership cells and the militias and whatever other branches exist, even if they lose communication, they're still guided by the same subset of principles and the same coherent, well defined ideology that they don't actually need that communication and can operate independently when necessary. Pretty important aspect. Let's see. One should not minimize Moscow's importance. Politically, economically, and strategically, it is the USSR's most important center. Not because it contains the government, this is relatively unimportant, for governments can move. Moscow produces 15% of the USSR's total industrial output. It is the greatest industrial center. It is roughly comparable to Chicago, having about the same population, 4,137,018 in the 1939 census. Like Chicago, it is the terminus of many railroads, which do not pass through the city but shoot out from it like the spokes of a wheel. Moscow has always been a fairly strong strategic center. In the wars of intervention that overran most of the Soviet territory, Moscow was not reached. In recent years, its strategic possibilities have been greatly developed. Its 11 diverging railways have been connected by a belt railway, a great ring in the city's outskirts. This makes it possible to shift troops and supplies in any direction and gives great mobility to a defending force. Supplementing the railways is a new system of canals, which has changed Moscow from an inland city to a port accessible to five seas: the Baltic, White, Caspian, Azov, and Black Sea and Black Seas. Sorry. Even if the enemy were on three sides of Moscow, the city could draw supplies from the fourth. The canals, very vulnerable to guerrillas, would be of much less use to an invader. Supplementing the railways and canals is a new boulevard system, also consisting of diverging spokes connected by two wide concentric rings. They have been widened in recent years and are now from 3 to 5 times as wide as New York's Fifth Avenue. I was one of those Moscow dwellers who rather mourned the removal of trees from the center of the ring boulevards and the taking down of a lot of Bresk old churches at traffic junctions. It made the city look bare and seemed not entirely demanded by the existing traffic. But now it is clear that this has made Moscow perhaps the most tremendous fortress in the world. 1.5 million people can converge on its central square and march through in a few hours. They do it twice each year on the big holidays. From 3 to 6 lines of motorized troops, including tanks, can be shot in any one of a dozen directions through the city without a traffic jam. They would even have protection in the long lines of massive concrete apartment houses built on both sides of these boulevards in the past few years. If the enemy tried to use the boulevards in a reverse direction, the apartment houses would become concrete forts, raining down grenades. Yeah, I remember Mike Duncan's podcast Revolutions talking about the Russian Revolution, and he was talking about how the architecture of the city, the way it's set up, was actually really conducive for the protesters who turned revolutionaries, for the people who actually held that revolution. He said something about it with like wide alleys or like boulevards that go straight on through the city, like they just keep going for a long time. It allowed people to like easily coalesce together into these peasant armies that took over the whole. That ended up, succeeding. Obviously, I'm like, it's like the TLDR version, but like I just remember him saying that. So it seems like the Soviets took that into account, learned from the history of how they were able to overthrow the Tsarist regime in Moscow, and then tried to make it more of a fortress, as we're reading here. Very interesting stuff. Moscow can make all the implements of war, including planes and motor trucks, inside the city. Her electric power no longer comes from long haul coal, as during the wars of intervention. It is based on local deposits well behind the town, developed in the past 15 years. Her water supply comes from a mighty river, which in recent years has been augmented by waters flowing from the north. It winds for miles in a protected zone within the outer fortifications, purifying itself as it goes. By complete utilization of all the city garbage for both heating farm greenhouses and fertilizing great gardens, Moscow now gets its vegetables, including potatoes, from areas very near. Even wheat has been moved north by modern farming methods and seed selection, so that areas fairly close to Moscow can supply the city's needs. Moscow's sky is covered by an air defense that was the marvel of London experts who visited it after the war began to make suggestions. Uh, after the war began to make suggestions, I guess, who visited after the war began to make suggestions and found it far superior to London's. Anti aircraft shells make a thick blanket at four distinct levels to London's one, and observation planes patrol the heavens night and day. Moscow's 4 million people also offer a night and day defense. Moscow would thus be most difficult of all the Soviet cities for an enemy to conquer. It could point on it could put on the most epoch-making siege in history. The cost in men would probably break the German armies. If it should fall, it would be the heaviest single loss the Soviet forces could sustain. The war would pass at once to a different phase, to a last-ditch battle. But even if Moscow fell, the Red Army and the Soviet people could still fight on. Ever since Lenin's day, the Ural Mountains have been regarded as the last ditch of the Soviet defense. Every Soviet child learns in his history lessons that Lenin was ready in 1919 and 20 to retreat to the Urals if this were the only shelter hard-pressed Soviet power. Even then, the Urals had some metallurgical industry based on its great mineral resources. This, together with the geography of the Urals, made it a suitable last-line defense. To reach the Urals, an invader must first cross the Volga River, one of the world's great waterways, and then fight uphill through fields and forests for close to 1,000 miles toward the mountains. It would be almost like fighting the way across the Mississippi and all the way to the Rockies to conquer an army drawing supplies from the mountain states and the Pacific coast. It also is funny to me how often people like speculate and pontificate about the geography of Afghanistan or even Iran, any of these Middle Eastern countries, and they'll talk about those as being the excuse. They'll use it to Vietnam too. Talk about the jungles and say geography is always the reason that the US loses wars. It could never just be that the communists were more dedicated, that they actually had like an existential crisis to fight for, and therefore were more motivated than like, I don't know, some fucking teenagers who were doing it for money or were doing it because of like some kind of societal pressure telling them that they needed to go do it, who didn't really want to be there, who then, upon understanding the conflict or the nature of the conflict they're in, realize that they are the bad guys. It couldn't be any of those things. It just has to be geography. But then even like taking that into account, these same like neocons and like, US sympathetic quote unquote objective observers of war history and battles never apply that to Russia. Never think that the US would have trouble winning a war against Russia or China because of their geography, because they have these enormous land masses. That never applies. Very funny. All right, I'm going to wrap it up here soon. In the past 15 years, the areas beyond the Urals have been greatly developed as part of a nationwide plan. As early as 1918, Lenin stressed the need of a more rational distribution of Russian industry to meet the strain of any future war. In those days, the discussion was largely theoretical. It was based on the knowledge that a barbarously irrational distribution of Tsarist industry was one of the factors in Russia's collapse. Most of Tsarist industry was located close to the German borders and was seized at once by the invader. In the rest of the country, there was little correlation between the location of industry and raw materials. This added to the difficulties and unreliability of transport and caused industry to break down. A first aim of the Soviet government was therefore not only rapid increase of industry, but its rational distribution. Increasingly, great industrial plants were built close to their raw materials, thus lessening transport. Industry was developed throughout the country, and a whole series of relatively self-sufficient regions was created, each having the materials and industries necessary to feed, clothe, shelter, and arm its population in case of war. Yeah, they're not even just doing like socialism in one country. They're doing like socialism in one area, one locality, in one geographic location. And they're doing it all across the whole several, like their whole united countries that they have going on. The greatest relative development of Soviet industry in the past 15 years, especially of the war industries, has taken place behind the Urals. After Japan's invasion of Manchuria, this development was especially speeded. This area is still far behind European Russia in total output. The three greatest centers of industry in the USSR are still Moscow, Leningrad, and eastern Ukraine. But whereas the western centers produced more than 9/10 of the production of Tsarist Russia, their relative weight is now less. The fuel and metal industries beyond the Urals now turn out between a quarter and a third of the country's total output. They produce far more than the whole of Tsarist Russia produced in the First World War. Yeah, you love to see them turn it around. You love to see socialism succeeding. All right, you guys, I'm going to bookmark this one, and I'm going to wrap it up for the day. I'm at an hour, which means that my noise canceling has run out, so my mic will sound worse. But I appreciate you guys all joining. Hopefully you continue to enjoy this, and this will be out on the podcast feed, probably in the next couple weeks or so. Like the good buffer between when they actually are recorded and when they come out. So anyway, thanks again.